All right, friends and neighbors, welcome back to CCNA Volume 2, Chapter 4, Security Architectures. In this video, as always, we'll do the key topics. Our exam section, define key security concepts, threats, vulnerabilities, exploits, a little bit of mitigation, describe security program elements and password policies, differentiate authentication, authorization, and accounting. These are servers that are on the network that keep track of things, and then the do I know this already questions. So our key topics, the big ideas in this chapter, security terminology. So we'll be a little short on demos in this video, but we will talk about a lot of different kinds of attacks and some policies and password things to talk about. Types of malware, there's a whole bunch of them, and a lot of them are very similar, but there's some differentiation there. What do you do about people? Users are sometimes our worst enemies, even though they don't even know it or aren't trying to be. Some password vulnerabilities, as we said. AAA functions, these are keeping track of things. And then what do you do about educating your users? So some security terminology. So no network is perfect. And the other analogy or the other idea that we sometimes put out there is that if you totally secured your network to where it was perfect, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. So there are all kinds of things that create problems on a network in terms of security. First of all, there are things that are unknown, but we also don't know what users are going to do, right? Sometimes users accidentally do things. Sometimes users go against their training. Sometimes users are scared or think they're doing the right thing. We have unknown devices or MAC addresses, IP addresses that pop up all the time. My favorite example is the Internet of Things devices. These things pop up all over the place. Other examples are people bringing in their laptops, their phones. There are all kinds of problems with devices that wind up on your network that you didn't expect. And these days, everything has a network stack in it, so we wind up with all kinds of networks, sometimes even protocols that we don't recognize. The minute you have internet access, you have problems, right? Somebody can get in through your network, and all you wanted to do is provide outside connectivity. But of course, that's the vector for the bad guys. Wireless, I've heard wireless described as like sprinkling jacks around the parking lot and around your neighboring buildings. And so wireless access, the minute you allow that, it's a vector for attack. Your stuff is out in the cloud. How do you get to it, and is it secured properly? These things and almost every other kind of system adds threat vectors and unknowns that are hard to keep track of. So in order to secure a network, it's easier if you understand what might go wrong and the sort of threat landscape that's out there. That is, all the things that are, vectors or vulnerabilities in our network systems today. Now, the book example is a secure box, right? We can take a box and we can totally secure it, but then we say, well, wait a minute, I want access to the box. I just want to be able to get to what's in there. So you put a door in there. Well, that allows access to the owner of the box, but you can also accidentally provide access to other folks to the insides of the box. And these sorts of examples go on and on with the box. Now, there's a couple of terms that we use to describe sort of this idea of, well, what constitutes an actual threat. The first thing is a vulnerability. So anything that is considered a weakness. Maybe a good example is Beowulf, right? Didn't he bathe in the dragon's blood or something like that? And then he had a leaf that landed in the middle of his shoulder blades. But nobody knew it was there. It was vulnerable. It was a weakness. But if nobody knows it's there, is it really, really terrible? Well, you have an exploit. In this case, a sword. But if you have some tool that can take advantage of the vulnerability. And then the threat is the potential to use the exploit against the vulnerability. So somebody standing behind you with a sword, right? So these are how the terms sort of go together. Now, another vulnerability that's maybe closer to home is you have an operating system that is unpatched. Well, nobody knows it's unpatched until they find it. So they find it, and they figure out that it's unpatched. Do they have the tools or software to exploit the fact that it's unpatched? And then, is this thing connected to the internet, or is it on a DMZ somewhere? These are things that would make things a little more risky. Now, mitigation techniques are the ways that we counteract or prevent malicious activity. So patching that machine, putting a firewall on it, all these kinds of things would be mitigation techniques. Common security threats. The first up is spoofing. Now, a spoofing attack is any kind of attack that spoofs an address. That is to say, pretends to be something else. So if you're on a network and somebody else uses your IP address, they are spoofing your IP address. Same thing with a MAC address. Now, there are many, many approaches that are based on address security. So a firewall rule or an access control list like we just did, those would be based on IP addresses. But we also have MAC address ACLs. Right? Those are numbered 700 to 799. But even things like wireless security can be based on your MAC address. So what does somebody do when they're spoofing an address? Well, it might be as simple as pretending to be you or a valid node on the network. But it might also be that the traffic itself is being modified. So they're not pretending to be you, but they're passing off traffic that gets by firewalls or that is valid for a particular service. And denial of service attacks are targeted against usually services that are providing our network infrastructure. Now, there are a wide variety of denial of service attacks. There's all kinds, and they exist at all layers of our OSI or TCP/IP models. But the idea is this, that if your network is got a bunch of well-behaved users and sufficient provisioning for all the services that those users are using, life is good. But denial of service attacks can massively increase or use simple known behavior of protocols to shut down these services. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is a simple 802.11 deauthentication attack. And this one just takes advantage of the way that 802.11 operates. An 802.11 node or a Wi-Fi node first says I have to find the network, and then it requests authentication into the network. Well, if you simply send an 802.11 node a deauthentication packet, it disconnects from the network and then has to reconnect. So you can denial of service a whole bunch of wireless nodes. Now, there are brute force denial of service attacks, right, where we just send a whole bunch of traffic at a particular node. But then there are attacks that are more esoteric. There are attacks that just take advantage of the basic behavior of a protocol. So the example in the book is the TCP handshake exploit. Now, it's very common for a server to limit the number of connections. So let's say that you're dealing with an FTP or an HTTP server and you're limited to 20 users or so at any one time, so 20 concurrent users. Each user performs a TCP handshake with that server, and after 20 users have logged on, we can't have any more. Now, in a perfect world, that's 20 users. But what if somebody says, I'm going to send a TCP packet with a SYN flag set to that server, and the server sends back a SYN ACK, but then the attacker doesn't send anything else? Well, that one connection is now locked up. So nobody else can use that because the server has to time that connection out because it thinks it's a valid connection that's being established. So now the attacker sends another TCP packet with a SYN flag set. The server responds with a SYN ACK. That's 2. And the attacker just continues to do that. Now, this is a very lightweight attack in terms of traffic, right? It's just 20 packets. But those 20 packets could lock up all of the connections for a server. And the only thing that gets you out of it is whether or not the connections would time out. So that is a denial of service that's actually not a brute force denial of service at all. Now, a much larger denial of service is a distributed denial of service where many, many nodes are engaged in attacking the same target. So this is vectors coming in from all over the place, and overwhelm a server with either the number of connections or sheer traffic. Now, reflection and amplification attacks are related to the spoofing because they are changing the addressing that's used in particular packets. So an attacker will send a packet, but what is he trying to do in this case? Well, if it was a simple spoofing, it might be pretending to be somebody else. But in a reflection attack, what the attacker is trying to do now is trying to send traffic to a server and pretend to be somebody else so that the server sends traffic to that node. And if you do this enough times, you can shut down that node's connections. Now, an amplification attack is one in which the attacker sends something to the reflector, the server, and the server responds with a whole bunch of traffic. Now, a simple example is a website. You make one request to a website and you might get a whole bunch of traffic, right? So send one request, an HTTP GET, and you actually get a lot of traffic back. There are a lot of services that work like that. So the goal of an amplification attack is to consume network bandwidth, but also disrupt the target. In this case, some poor node on the network somewhere that's all of a sudden getting all this traffic unsolicited. There are a couple of protocols that have been used to perform these. DNS and NTP are two of them. Now, man-in-the-middle attack takes all of this stuff and sort of steps it up a notch. So in addition to potentially disrupting communication, the attacker eavesdrops on a transmission. So this is a man-in-the-middle attack. So what's got to happen for the man-in-the-middle is that there's going to be two nodes that are communicating. So they're talking back and forth, and the man-in-the-middle pops in here and says this: I'm going to pretend to be both ends of the connection, and I'm going to trick both ends of the connection into sending things to me, and I will forward them to the right direction. So if node A wants to talk to node B, it first sends it to the attacker, and then the attacker forwards it. And the same thing going back the other way. It forwards it to the attacker, and the attacker keeps the conversation going. So the man in the middle is actually invisible to A and B. Now, what applications or what protocols can be used to accomplish man in the middles? Well, the one in the book is the ARP man in the middle, otherwise known as the ARP poisoning attack. And the idea is this: all nodes that are on an IPv4 network have an ARP table. And when an attacker drops in, it poisons all the ARP tables. And what that means is that the attacker sends ARP responses for everything. So that in the ARP table, only the attacker's MAC address appears for all of those destination nodes. And if you do that with all the nodes, every time the nodes want to generate Ethernet frames or 802.11 frames, they believe that they should go to the attacker because you're using the attacker's MAC address. And in that way, all the attacker has to do is continue to forward the traffic that's been sent to it. A and B, the two endpoints, don't know, and the attacker can eavesdrop. Another example is an ICMP redirect attack. Now, often at the beginning of every security threat is a reconnaissance attack. Now, this is not technically an attack, although if you see somebody asking a bunch of questions on your network, you might think that something is up. So reconnaissance is aimed at understanding the vulnerabilities in a particular network. So the attacker is at this point gaining information. So this is sometimes called the attack that leads to a larger attack. So the attacker is doing all kinds of reconnaissance about your network and is trying to understand all of the nodes that are out there, your IP address scheme, etc., etc. So common tools that are used for this are NSLOOKUP, DIG. You can do ping sweeps of the IP address space, port scans to see what ports are available. But even your own protocols, such as DHCP, can tell somebody an awful lot about your network. Now, buffer overflow attacks are all about memory. Machines, such as servers, store data in memory. So when you're having a conversation with a server, both the endpoints, the client, and the server are communicating with data that they pull out of memory, and then they receive stuff and put it back in memory while they're processing it. If memory is properly maintained, everything is good. All is well. But if memory is not properly constrained, or the data chunks are enormous where you run out of space, some systems will allow that data to be written in other memory locations, in effect overflowing the buffer space or the memory space allocated to the application. Now, some tools can actually read what's in the buffer, but what if the data that overflowed into the next memory space was a set of instructions, program code? So now you go back to the regular buffer that's being used for the application, not realizing that somewhere else is an actual instruction that's been stored. The target machine may then read that as an actual instruction and run that code. So these are the dangers with buffer overflow. You can actually shut down a service or even execute code unintentionally. Now, malware, viruses, worms, and Trojans, oh my. So malware gets its name from malicious software. These are software packages disguised in other innocuous packages or even email. So you've all seen it, right? You get somebody that sends you an email and they're trying to get you to click on something. Now we'll come back to that idea here in a second. But if a software installer can get you to install software that you didn't ask for, now my favorite example isn't really malware, but every time you install something, if you're given a virus scanner or a malware scanner on top of that, or a service because you installed some other software that you wanted, that's an example of software that was buried inside there. Now, in that case, it's not malware, but it's annoyingware. I'll call it that. So if it's malicious, meaning that it's about to do some damage or exfiltrate data or something of that sort, then we would be calling it malware. Now, on this topic, there are a bunch of different kinds of programs. One is a Trojan horse. The Trojan horse is exactly what it sounds like, right? It appears to be something else, but you bring this inside the walls, you install this software, and you get something that you weren't expecting. Now, sometimes it's because you clicked on a link or followed a link that you thought was the right thing. Sometimes it's because you installed a USB stick that you shouldn't have. So this is why we always have to observe good sense when we're browsing online, answering email, or installing software. Now the goal of the Trojan horse is simply to get it itself installed. Now what it does after that is different for different software. So a virus, similar, right? This is in the malicious software or malware topic, but the idea of a virus is that it does something to destroy the machine or maybe lock the machine down. So we've all heard of ransomware as well. So ransomware is maybe one of the worst kinds of malware that's out there, where they actually lock up your machine and hold you for ransom, right? I will unlock your machine if you give me money or Bitcoin. So a virus is a little bit different in that it's trying to spread. It's trying to, once you install it on the machine, it's trying to find something else that it can get into. I worked at a place that was infected by malware around the holiday time. It was disguised as a screensaver. So it looked like a screensaver, acted like a screensaver, but it was actually scooping up all your passwords. Now, a worm is another kind of malware that tries to replicate itself, spread and then replicate itself again. So very, very tough to get rid of. A lot of these things, you delete them and then you turn right around and it's back again. So they're very, very tough to get rid of. Okay, let's talk about people for a second. Now, some software can infect a system through software or OS vulnerabilities, right? So somebody does the reconnaissance, they come across the network and they see there's a vulnerability, they have the exploit, and now they're an actual threat, so they actually get software installed in a vulnerable machine. Okay, so that's an attacker from outside that finds the target. But sometimes we can simply take advantage of human behavior to get access to passwords or information, because human beings are notorious for our willingness to download something. I want a free tool that does this, and I will download it from anywhere almost. I will share stuff. Hey, guess what? I found some great MP3s. Here, you can have those too. By the way, here's all the viruses that come along with it. Sometimes humans simply want to comply. You get a strongly worded email from some source that says, follow this link and update your machine, and you do it because you think you're doing the right time or doing the right thing. Sometimes we simply want to take shortcuts, right? We don't want to observe the best possible procedures or policies, and so we take shortcuts. We make passwords that are too small, etc., etc. Sometimes we're just trying to be helpful or show how much we know. So somebody could be looking over your shoulder at what you're typing. You put your sticky note underneath your keyboard for your passwords. All of these things are problems with humans. I have seen users try to be helpful and give everybody access to a system because they think they're supposed to be there. I'm a contractor and I'm trying to get work done. Can you help me? So there are a bunch of different ways that we can take advantage of, or bunch of different ways that humans are taken advantage of. One is phishing, luring victims to websites designed to extract information from users. We see this all the time. You get an email, follow this link. I notice that you're not using an updated system. You should be doing this virus control. Here you go. Go ahead and click on this link. Sometimes they look very official. So phishing is the general category, and then there are a whole bunch of specialized phishing attacks. So spear phishing targets a particular set of users, the IT group, for example, people that we think might have valuable information. Whaling is where we go after a high power user, an executive of some kind. Phishing, voicemail, right? You get a voicemail that says, call this number and provide your username and password. Smishing is the same thing, but with the messaging service. Now, farming is a little bit different because it compromises a service and then uses the service to direct users to malicious sites. So if your domain name server is compromised, or I can spoof the IP address of a name server and get you to come to me, and you get bad information, and then you wind up on malicious sites. So that's farming. And a watering hole is, again, related. It's compromising a site itself so that anyone visiting that site is affected. So it's a very particular set of users that use a service. Passwords, passwords, passwords. All right, so there are so many obvious problems with passwords, right? Using the default password, using your birth date, easy to guess passwords, making them too short, never changing them. These are all standard problems with passwords. Now, there are lots of websites that are dedicated to publishing default passwords, IP addresses, and SNMP strings for almost every device and manufacturer out there. You can just simply Google these sites, and they have piles of information out there. So get off the default settings immediately. Now, if somebody is trying to find your password, there are two general categories to do this. One is online attacks, just simply trying various combinations in real time. So they're trying to log in as you, and they're trying the simple passwords, or they're just trying to get access to the device. Did they leave a default password on this thing? Now, offline attacks are where we've observed the login conversation, right? We've observed somebody trying to get access, and they've logged in. And so I've got an encrypted version of their username, maybe an encrypted version of their password. And I'm now going to try and break the password. And what do? I go offline now, and I apply dictionary or brute force attacks trying to crack the password. Even if I don't know the hash that was used for the password, I can try different hashes and different phrases until I get what looks to be the password that you used. So these are offline attacks, and then I would try and log in as you online. Now, all of these are reasons why password policies require a certain length of password, right? We want long passwords, or at least passwords of a minimum length, upper and lowercase characters, numbers, punctuation, all built into your password. Now, when we talk about multi-factor authentication, your password, something you know, is called single factor. Multi-factor is where we add an additional value or factor from a different source. So the multi-factor is very often something you have, so your phone, right? If somebody doesn't have your phone, then it makes it very difficult for them to break in. If somebody compromised your password, it might be easy for them to get in, but having the second factor makes it much more difficult. That's what we mean by multi-factor. In fact, older systems, you would log in and the system would disconnect and say, I'm going to call you right back at your phone number and we'll connect from there. And if you're a bad guy, of course, you wouldn't have the phone number for the dial-up access. Today, we do that with sending text messages for codes onto your cell phone. Now, certificates are yet another factor, but one that includes encrypted data, namely the public key, as well as user IDs. Now, certificates are digitally signed by what's called a certificate authority. So they're validated, and they only work with a matching key. Now, this goes to a whole big architecture called public and private key pairs and public key infrastructure. But the idea is that if you use a certificate to log in, your certificate will only work with the matching key. Other credentials or other factors include biometrics, right? Now this would be something you are. So we have something you know, something you have, and now something you are. So your fingerprint, your face, your eyes, palm prints, all of these things are something that you are. And they would be yet another factor that could be used. Now, the minute we start talking about controlling and monitoring user access, what we're usually talking about is AAA servers. Now, AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Now, what is this doing in a CCNA? Well, all of your routers and switches can have local user accounts on them, but they can also be tied to accounts that are on or authenticated by an AAA server of some kind. It's just an authentication server or a login server. So what happens? You go to log into a router or a switch, and you're either going to be authenticated against the local accounts, or that router or switch is going to be connected to a server that's doing AAA. So the three activities are going to be that we're going to authenticate. Who is this user? Does the user have the right credentials? Now let's just say that it's username and password. Okay. What is this user allowed to do? Are they given executive privilege, or is there something else that they can do? Can they make changes? Can they just take a look at the show commands? Or are they not allowed in at all? And then there's accounting. Okay, this person just logged in. We're going to keep a log of all the things that this user did. And that's the accounting part, so AAA. Now, what kind of AAA servers are we usually talking about? Well, the two most common for Cisco are going to be the TACX or Radius. Now, the TACX is Cisco proprietary, TCP port 49. And Radius is a public standard. You can read about that in RFCs with UDP ports 1812 and 1813. So in these cases, you would tie your router or switch to the AAA server that you were using. And when somebody logged in, you would pass those credentials onto the AAA server, which would either authenticate or deauthenticate the user. Okay, developing a security program to educate users. Well, it's easy to get mad at users when they make mistakes or they create problems, and this is why we need some kind of education for users. So you put out a policy and you create a program to regularly revisit problems or even update things when things change. So a security problem can be very effective at educating users about attacks, such as phishing, the correct action to take when things go wrong, password policies, and so on. The basic elements of a security program include user awareness, talking about all the things that we've been talking about today. So data confidentiality, both the company's and personal, attacks, what kinds of things to look out for, what to do with email, what not to do with email, procedure upon data loss, and so on. Now the training is typically annual, but it should be periodic in some way, shape, or form. Now, another important idea is physical access control. There are spaces that users are not allowed to go in, And if you're authorized users, then there are rules for those as well. So the common spaces that we talk about are data closets, data centers. These must remain locked. And you have badge access, and this is another factor, right? Another thing that you have that allows you to get in and out, but maybe not in and out of everywhere. This also allows us to keep an audit trail. So what were folks doing? What was this ID card used for? And so on. And another example that's important to keep track of is when somebody quits or is fired or retires, they had all these credentials. You want to make sure that you remove all of that access that was associated with that user when they leave the organization. All right, do you know this already? Which one of the following terms means anything that can be considered to be a weakness that can compromise security? Well, that was B, the vulnerability, right? An actual potential to exploit a vulnerability is known as which one of the following terms? Well, that would be a threat. You're vulnerable, but if nobody can take advantage of it, there's no exploit there. And then if they can, now we have our threat. In a spoofing attack, which of the following parameters are commonly spoofed? MAC addresses and source IP addresses are the most commonly spoofed items. Question number 4. Suppose an attacker sends a series of packets towards a destination address with a TCP SYN flag set, but no other packet types. Which of the following attacks is likely taking place? Well, this is the one that we talked about. This is a denial of service that's taking advantage of the TCP handshake behavior. Question number 5. In a reflection attack, the source IP address in the attack packets is spoofed so that it contains which one of the following entities? Well, in reflection attacks and amplification attacks, the destination will be the address of the victim because the attacker is just trying to send traffic to that victim via the reflector. Question number 6. During a successful man-in-the-middle attack, which two of the following actions is the attacker most likely to perform? Well, the whole reason for a man-in-the-middle attack is to do eavesdropping, so that was one. Now, the data modification part is the attacker has to complete the connection. So the attacker has to forward traffic between, say, the client and server. Question number 7, which of the following is the goal of a brute force attack? Well, brute force is exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to try this and try this and try this and try this until I find the right thing. So trying every combination of characters to guess the password. Which one of the following is an example of an AAA server? Well, that was the ISE, the security engine that Cisco uses, and that includes the TACX and the Radius AAA servers. Question number 9, physical access control is important for which one of the following reasons? It prevents access to closets. The chapter 5 look ahead, we're going to bring this back to the devices. So we're going to be doing securing iOS passwords and hashes on those accounts, encoding passwords for local usernames, right? So this will be the local account. We'll talk about traditional firewalls. Now we've already done ACL, so this will be the next step. And then we'll add IPSs or intrusion prevention systems. Well, there we go. This has been Chapter 4, Security Architectures. We're just getting used to some of the terminology, right? So we talked about vulnerabilities, exploits, threats, and attack types. Things like man-in-the-middle. We talked about the human factors. We talked about spoofing attacks and so on. Then we move down to users and the problems they create and what we need to do with users to educate them, passwords and security programs. And now you know that we're on to securing the passwords on iOS devices and looking at firewalls and IPSs. So like and subscribe if you're ready to secure those devices. May those packets always reach their destinations no matter what kind of attack they have to suffer their way through. And this is CCNA. You can do this.